You ever have one of those nights where the sky splits open and the wind sounds like it's trying to tear the world apart at the seams? That was the kind of night it was in Dry Hollow, New Mexico. The kind of night that finds a lonely man and reminds him of just how alone he really is. Inside a sturdy but quiet ranch house, Judah Keene stood watch at the window. He was a man built of hard angles and harder memories, with eyes that had seen too much, and a silence that had lasted 3 years ever since malaria stole his wife, Sarah. All he had left of her was their daughter, 10-year-old Ellie, who sat by the fire, lost in a dime novel, her face glowing in the warm light. She had her mother's stubborn chin and quiet fire. Judah watched her like a man guarding his last dollar. That's when the knock came. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was a desperate hammering sound, almost lost in the howl of the storm. Nobody came this far out unless they were running from something or running toward trouble. Judah didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy rifle from its perch above the door, his movements sure and practiced. He cracked the door just enough to see out, his body blocking the view from inside the house. And what he saw made the cold in his bones settle even deeper. A woman, soaked to the skin, was clutching a small child to her chest. She looked like a ghost the rain had spat out. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear that went far beyond the storm. "Please," she whispered, her voice a raw rasp. "I don't need nothing. Just a dry place for my girl, the barn, anything." Judah's face was stone. He'd learned a long time ago that trouble often came wearing a pitiful face. He looked from the woman to the child wrapped in her arms, a little bundle of stillness. He measured the risk, the way you measure a thundercloud on the horizon. He was about to send her away, to tell her to keep moving, that this wasn't a charity house. He started to close the door, the word no already forming on his lips. But then, the little girl in the woman's arms whimpered, a tiny broken sound that cut through the wind. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 3 years, not since Sarah. And in that moment, something inside him, something he thought had died and been buried, cracked open. He said nothing. He just stepped back, pulling the heavy door open, and pointed a single, calloused finger toward the barn. The woman didn't need to be told twice. She gave him a quick, grateful nod, her eyes full of a relief so profound it was painful to look at, and hurried through the mud toward the relative safety of the barn. Judah watched her go, the rain plastering her thin dress to her back. He felt a small tug on his sleeve and looked down. Ellie was standing beside him, her book forgotten, her eyes fixed on the two strangers. "She has a little girl," Ellie whispered, her voice full of a child's simple awe. "It's not our concern," Judah said, his voice harsher than he intended. But he didn't close the door. Not right away. He stood there for a long time watching the barn, the rifle still held loose in his hand, a silent sentinel in the raging storm. He told himself it was just for one night, just until the storm passed. He had no idea that the real storm was just beginning. Later that night, after the rain had softened to a miserable drizzle, Judah carried a thick wool blanket and a tin cup of water out to the barn. He didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the door and forget the woman and her child existed. But the image of that little girl's face, so pale and still, wouldn't leave him. He pushed the heavy barn door open, just a crack, and set the items on a clean pile of hay just inside. He didn't call out or make a sound. He just left them and turned to go. But as he pulled the door shut, he heard a soft whisper from the darkness inside. "God bless you." He froze, his hand on the door. He didn't reply. He just closed it, the latch clicking into place with a sound that felt terribly final. Back in the house, Ellie was already asleep, curled under a quilt, her face peaceful. Judah stood over her, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. He was her protector, her only one. He wouldn't let anything or anyone threaten that. He'd let the woman stay for the night, but in the morning, she would be gone. He was sure of it. But when morning came, a cold, clean light washing over the muddy landscape, the barn door was still closed. Judah went about his chores, his jaw set, his eyes constantly straying toward the barn. He fed the horses, checked the fences, his movements sharp with an unspoken tension. He was just heading back to the house when the barn door creaked open. The woman stepped out, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. The little girl was right behind her, holding her hand. They looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile. The woman saw him watching. She didn't smile, just gave a slow, respectful nod. "Name's Marion," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "This is Clara." Judah just grunted in response. He expected her to say thank you and be on her way. He expected her to ask for directions to the nearest town. He did not expect what she said next. "That fence post by the corral is loose," she said, pointing. "A strong wind could take the whole section down. And your water trough has a leak. You're losing half your water to the mud." Judah stared at her. He knew about the fence post. He knew about the trough. He'd been meaning to fix them for weeks, but the lonely work of the ranch always seemed to pile up. For this stranger, this woman who had shown up like a stray in a storm, to point it out, it felt like a judgment. "I'll handle my own damn ranch," he said, his voice a low growl. Marion didn't flinch. She just looked him square in the eye. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said, her voice firm. "I'm asking for work. I can mend a fence, patch a trough, and I can cook. Let us earn our keep for a few days, just until we can get on our feet." Judah was about to refuse. The words were right there, ready to come out. But then he saw little Clara, half hidden behind her mother's skirt, peering out at Ellie, who had just stepped onto the porch. There was a look of profound, aching loneliness in both girls' eyes. And Judah, a man who knew loneliness like the back of his own hand, found he couldn't say no. "Fine," he bit out. "The tools are in the shed. Don't break anything." He turned and stalked into the house, leaving the two women and their daughters in the quiet morning air. He was already regretting it. A few days, he told himself. A few days, and then they'd be gone. He had no idea how wrong he was. And so, a strange, new rhythm began at the ranch in Dry Hollow. Marion was a worker. There was no denying that. She rose before the sun, and by the time Judah came out, she'd already be hard at it. She didn't just mend the fence post, she checked the entire line, tightening wires and replacing rotting wood. She didn't just patch the trough, she scrubbed it clean of algae. She moved with a quiet, relentless purpose that Judah found both irritating and impressive. She never asked for help, and she never complained. She just worked. And while she worked, Clara and Ellie began a cautious dance of their own. At first, they just watched each other from a distance, two lonely planets in their own orbits. Then Ellie left one of her dime novels on a hay bale near where Clara was playing. A few hours later, Clara left a small, smooth rock on the porch railing for Ellie. It was a silent conversation, a language of small gifts. One afternoon, Judah came in from the fields, tired and covered in dust, to the smell of something he hadn't smelled in years. Fresh bread. Marianne was standing at the stove, her face flushed from the heat, pulling a perfect, golden brown loaf from the oven. "Use the last of your flour," she said, not looking at him. "I'll work it off." Judah just stood there, speechless. The smell filled the small kitchen, wrapping around him, pulling at memories he kept locked away. Sarah had loved to bake bread. He could almost see her standing there, a smudge of flour on her nose. "It's fine," he managed to say, his voice thick. He turned to leave, needing to escape the memory, but Marion's voice stopped him. "The little one, Clara," she said softly. "She's got a cough. It's just a small one, but she's frail." Judah turned back. Marion's eyes were filled with a worry that was so raw, so familiar, it felt like a punch to the gut. It was the same look he'd seen in his own eyes in the mirror 100 times when Ellie was small. "There's an old chest," he said, his voice low. "Upstairs in the bedroom. Sarah's things. There's herbs in there. For coughs." The air in the room grew heavy. He hadn't said his wife's name out loud to a stranger in 3 years. He had just opened a door he thought was nailed shut. Marion simply nodded, her eyes saying the thank you. She didn't speak. "And Marion," Judah added, his voice barely a whisper, "thank you for the bread." He left before she could reply, the scent of fresh baking and the ghost of his wife's memory following him out into the cold, empty plains. He was playing with fire, he knew that. He was letting this woman, this stranger, into the cracks of his life. But what he didn't know was that Marion wasn't just a widow looking for work. She was a woman with a secret, a dark and dangerous secret that had followed her across the territory. And it was only a matter of time before that secret showed up at his gate. The next few days passed in a blur of hard work and unspoken tension. Marion's presence was a constant, quiet hum in the background of the ranch. She fixed things Judah hadn't even realized were broken. A loose floorboard on the porch, a squeaking hinge on the gate, the torn lining of his winter coat. It was as if she was trying to mend the entire ranch, one small piece at a time. And as she worked, the two little girls, Clara and Ellie, grew closer. Their silent gift-giving had blossomed into whispered conversations and shared giggles. They built a fort in the hayloft, a secret kingdom made of old blankets and their own imaginations. Judah would watch them from a distance, a strange ache in his chest. The ranch hadn't heard the sound of children's laughter in a long, long time. It was a beautiful sound, and it terrified him. One evening, Judah was cleaning his rifle on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Marion came and sat on the steps, not too close but not too far away either. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant call of a coyote. "You're a good father," Marion said suddenly, her voice soft. Judah stopped what he was doing, his hand stilling on the cool metal of the gun. "Ellie watches you," Marion continued. "She's proud of you, even when you're being a stubborn old mule." A small, involuntary smile touched Judah's lips before he could stop it. "And you're a good mother," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "That little girl of yours, she looks at you like you're the sun and the moon." Marion pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'm all she's got," she whispered. "I have to be enough." There was something in her voice, a flicker of fear that made the hairs on the back of Judah's neck stand up. "You running from something, Marion?" he asked, his voice low and direct. He watched her profile in the fading light. He saw her jaw tighten, her hands clench in her lap. She was silent for a long moment, and he thought she wasn't going to answer. "We all are, aren't we?" she finally said, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. She stood up. "Clara's cough is worse. I used the last of those herbs." Before Judah could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the dark barn. Judah sat there on the porch, the rifle heavy in his lap. "We all are," she'd said, but he had a feeling that whatever Marion was running from was a lot more dangerous than the ghost he was trying to outrun, and he had a sick feeling in his gut that by letting her stay, he had invited her troubles to come find them. That night, the cough came back with a vengeance. It wasn't just a cough anymore. It was a deep, rattling sound that seemed to shake Clara's small frame. By midnight, she was burning with fever. Marion was frantic, her usual composure gone, replaced by a mother's desperate fear. She tried everything she knew, cool cloths, boiled water, but nothing worked. The fever just kept climbing. Finally, in desperation, she ran to the main house and pounded on the door. When Judah opened it, his face heavy with sleep, he saw the terror in her eyes and was instantly wide awake. "It's Clara," she choked out. "She's burning up. The herbs are gone. I don't know what else to do." Judah didn't ask questions. He just moved. "Bring her inside," he commanded, "to the main room, by the fire." He led the way, lighting lamps as he went. He laid Clara down on a cot he pulled close to the hearth, her small body limp and frighteningly still. Ellie came downstairs, rubbing her eyes, her face pale with worry. "Is she going to be okay?" she whispered. "Go back to bed, Ellie," Judah said, his voice gentle but firm. "We'll take care of her." As Ellie reluctantly went back upstairs, Judah went to a large dusty trunk in the corner of the room, one he hadn't opened in years. It was Sarah's. He lifted the heavy lid, the scent of dried lavender and old memories filling the air. He pushed aside folded quilts and stacks of letters, his hands searching for something. Finally, he pulled out a small dark blue tin. He opened it. Inside was a fine white powder. "Quinine," he said, his voice grim. "Sarah used it when the fever came through here a few years back. It's strong stuff." He measured a small, precise amount into a cup of water, his hand surprisingly steady. He brought it to the cot where Marion was holding Clara's head, whispering to her. "We need to get her to drink this," he said. Marion nodded, her eyes wide and pleading. Together, they managed to get a few sips of the bitter medicine past Clara's lips. Then there was nothing to do but wait. They sat by the fire, a silent, helpless vigil. The only sounds were the crackling flames, the howling wind outside, and Clara's shallow, ragged breaths. Hours passed. The moon crawled across the sky. Judah found himself watching Marion. He saw the way she never stopped touching her daughter, stroking her hair, holding her hand, as if she could pour her own strength into the child's body. He saw a fierceness in her, a love so powerful it was almost a physical force in the room. And he realized with a jolt that had nothing to do with the lack of sleep, that he didn't want her to leave. He didn't want either of them to leave. Just before dawn, when the world was a still, gray-blue, Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" she whispered, her voice weak but clear. Marianne let out a sob that was half laugh, half cry, burying her face in her daughter's hair. "I'm right here, baby. I'm right here." Judah felt a wave of relief, so intense it made him dizzy. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes for just a moment. The fever had broken. The girl would live. As the first rays of sun crept through the window, he looked at the woman and child, bathed in the soft morning light. A fragile, makeshift family huddled together in his home. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. But it didn't. It felt right. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Because as he looked at the blue tin of quinine in his hand, he remembered something else. He remembered there was only one dose left, and he remembered the man Sarah had bought it from, a traveling doctor who'd warned her that this particular strain of fever always came back. The next week was a fragile piece. Clara slowly regained her strength, her laughter once again filling the corners of the ranch. The unspoken bond between her and Ellie deepened into a sisterhood forged in the hayloft and cemented by shared secrets. Marion fell back into the rhythm of the ranch, but something had shifted between her and Judah. The walls were still there, but they weren't as high. They started talking more, sharing small, quiet moments on the porch at dusk. He told her about Sarah, about her love for the land and her fierce laugh. She told him about her parents, how they died of fever back in Texas, leaving her alone. She spoke of her past in vague, clipped sentences, always leaving out the most important details. She never mentioned a husband. She never explained who Clara's father was. Judah didn't push. He knew what it was like to carry a past you didn't want to talk about. But the peace was not meant to last. Trouble in a place like Dry Hollow travels on the wind, and the whispers had started. A lone widower, a strange woman, and a child who wasn't his. People talked. They saw Judah in town, buying more flour than one man and a girl would need. They saw the extra set of laundry hanging on the line, smaller and more colorful than Judah's plain work shirts. Pastor Elkins, a man whose piety was only exceeded by his nosiness, made a point of stopping by, his eyes scanning the property, looking for signs of sin. Judah met him at the gate, his face a thundercloud, and sent him packing before he could even get off his horse. The encounter left a sour taste in Judah's mouth. He was a private man. He didn't care what the town thought, but he knew that their judgment could be as dangerous as any predator. The breaking point came on a bright, cold Thursday morning. Judah was out by the corral, mending a bridle, when he heard the sound of a horse being ridden hard and fast. That was the first warning sign. No one rode that fast out here unless they were being chased or doing the chasing. A lone rider crested the hill and tore down the path, kicking up a cloud of dust. The man was dressed in clothes that were too fine for the trail, and he sat on his horse with an arrogant slump. He pulled up short at the gate, his horse skittering nervously. Marion, who had been weeding the small garden she'd started, looked up and froze. All the color drained from her face. Her body went rigid, her hand clutching the small trowel like a weapon. "Marion!" the man barked, his voice slick and unpleasant. He slid from his horse, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a look of smug ownership. Judah walked slowly toward the gate, his hands loose at his sides, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "You know this man?" Judah asked Marion, his voice a low rumble. Marion nodded once, her eyes never leaving the stranger. "His name is Lyle," she said, her voice tight and strained. "He was my husband." Lyle let out a short, ugly laugh. No was about it, darling. I've got the papers to prove it. You're still Mrs. Lyle Thorne, and you have something that belongs to me. His eyes slid past Marion, past Judah, and fixed on the barn where Clara had just poked her head out to see what the commotion was about. A greasy smile spread across Lyle's face. There she is, he said. My daughter. We're going home, Clara. Marion took a step forward, placing herself between Lyle and the barn. She is not your daughter, Marion hissed, her voice filled with a venom Judah had never heard before. You have no right. You left before she was even born. Details, details, Lyle sneered, waving a dismissive hand. She's got my blood. That makes her mine. And the law says a man has a right to his property, both my wife and my child. Judah had heard enough. He stepped forward, placing himself directly in Lyle's path. He was a good head taller than the other man, and years of hard ranch work had made him solid as an oak tree. This girl has a home, Judah said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of cold, hard granite. And you are not welcome in it. Get on your horse and ride. Lyle looked Judah up and down, a sneer playing on his lips. And who are you? The brave homesteader, protecting the poor, helpless widow. Don't be a fool. This is a family matter. You threatening her, Judah said, taking another slow step forward, makes it my matter. And I'm telling you one time, leave. Now. Lyle's eyes narrowed. The smug confidence wavered for a second, replaced by a flash of something ugly and violent. He looked from Judah's stony face to Marion's defiant one. This isn't over, he spat. I'll be back, and I'll have the law with me. A sheriff's badge beats a farmer's pride any day. With that, he swung himself back onto his horse and gave Marion one last venomous look and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and unanswered questions hanging in the air. As soon as Lyle was gone, the fight drained out of Marion. She swayed on her feet, and Judah reached out a hand to steady her. She flinched away from his touch, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. Don't, she snapped. Don't you dare pretend to be my savior. She turned and stormed toward the barn, her shoulders stiff. Judah followed her. Marion, wait, he called out. She spun around at the barn door, her face a mask of anguish. You think I wanted this? She cried, her voice breaking. You think I wanted him to find me? To bring his filth to your doorstep? That's not what I think, Judah said, his voice steady. Then what do you think, she demanded? That I'm some kind of charity case? Some broken thing you can fix to make yourself feel better about your own lonely life? Her words hit him like a physical blow, because there was a sliver of truth in them. He had been fine in his silence, in his grief, or so he had told himself. I was fine before you came here, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Oh, I'm sure you were, she shot back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Alone in this mausoleum you built for your dead wife, not needing anyone, not feeling anything. That was it. The dam inside him broke. You think this is easy for me? He roared, his voice echoing in the quiet yard. Having you here, having your daughter here, hearing laughter in this house again? It feels like I'm betraying my wife every damn second of the day. But then I see Ellie smile, a real smile for the first time in years. I see your little girl sleeping without nightmares. And I think maybe this isn't a betrayal. Maybe this is what living looks like. The silence that followed was deafening. They just stood there, breathing heavily, their angry, honest words hanging between them. Marion stared at him, her chest rising and falling, the anger in her eyes slowly being replaced by something else, something raw and vulnerable. He's not Clara's father, she said, her voice a ragged whisper. Judah waited. He can't be, she continued, her eyes pleading with him to understand. Her father was a good man, a kind man. He died before she was born. Lyle was my husband, by law. My father arranged it, but I ran away from him long before I met Clara's real father. Lyle thinks she's his. He thinks he has a claim. And the law? Judah asked quietly. The law will see a marriage certificate and a child born after the wedding, she said, her voice hollow. They won't care about the truth. They'll give her to him. The full weight of the situation crashed down on Judah. This wasn't just about a deadbeat husband. This was about a monster who would use the law to steal a child. And he, Judah Keene, had placed himself right in the middle of it. He looked at Marion, at the terror and desperation in her eyes. He thought of Ellie. He thought of what he would do if anyone ever tried to take her from him. There was no choice. Not really. He's not taking her, Judah said, his voice flat and final. I won't let him. Marion looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know enough, Judah replied, his gaze unwavering. I know you're a good mother, and I know you're in trouble. The rest, we'll figure it out. But as he said the words, a cold dread crept into his heart. Lyle had promised to come back with the law, but Judah had a feeling that the next time Lyle Thorne showed up, he wouldn't be alone, and he wouldn't be carrying a piece of paper. He'd be carrying a gun. The threat of Lyle's return hung over the ranch like a shroud. Every time a horse appeared on the horizon, every time a branch snapped in the wind, Marion would jump, her face pale. The easy, budding warmth that had started to grow between them was replaced by a tense, shared vigilance. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were allies in a silent war. Judah started carrying his rifle with him everywhere he went, even just to check the fences. At night, he took to sitting on the porch, watching the darkness, long after the women and children were asleep. He was a man guarding his fortress. But this time, he wasn't just guarding against loneliness. He was guarding against a real, flesh and blood enemy. One afternoon, Judah rode into town for supplies. He needed flour, salt, and more importantly, information. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside. The usual hum of conversation died the moment he walked in. All eyes turned to him. He could feel their stares, a mixture of curiosity and judgment. He ignored them, walking to the counter where Mr. Henderson, the portly store owner, was studiously avoiding his gaze. Need flour, Henderson, Judah said, his voice flat. Henderson busied himself weighing out the flour, his movements jerky. Heard you got company out at your place, Judah, he said, not looking up. Heard that company brought some trouble with it. You hear a lot of things, Judah replied, his voice dangerously quiet. A man was in here yesterday, Henderson continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A fancy fella, name of Lyle Thorne, was asking questions, asking who the sheriff was around here, asking about you. Judah's blood ran cold. And what did you tell him? Henderson finally looked up, his eyes wide and fearful. Nothing, Judah, I swear. Just told him Sheriff Miller is a fair man, follows the letter of the law. That's all. Judah paid for his supplies, his mind racing. Lyle wasn't just making idle threats. He was making plans. As Judah was leaving, Pastor Elkins stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Judah, the pastor said, his voice oozing with false concern, as your spiritual guide, I must advise you. You are harboring a woman of questionable character. You are inviting sin and trouble into your home. The town is concerned for your soul and for the soul of your daughter. Judah looked down at the small, self-righteous man. My soul is my own business, Pastor, he said, his voice like ice. And if you're so concerned about sin, maybe you should look a little closer to home. He pushed past the stunned pastor and left the store, the whispers of the townspeople following him out the door. He knew then that they would get no help from the town. They were on their own. That night, a new kind of storm rolled in. Not rain and wind, but a quiet, suffocating fear. After the girls were asleep, Judah and Marion sat at the kitchen table, the silence stretching between them. He's making his move, Judah said finally, telling her about his trip to town. He's going to use the law against us. Marion wrapped her arms around herself, her face grim. Then we have to run, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We can pack a few things, leave tonight, head north. We can disappear. Judah looked at her. He saw the desperate hope in her eyes, the same hope that had carried her all the way to his doorstep. But he also saw the flaw in her plan. And what then, Marion? He asked gently. How long until he finds you again? You can't run forever. A woman and child alone? It's a hard life, a dangerous one. Sooner or later, your luck will run out. Then what do we do? She cried, her voice cracking. We can't fight the law. Maybe we don't have to fight the law, Judah said, a slow, dangerous idea beginning to form in his mind. Maybe we have to give the law something else to fight. He stood up and began to pace the small kitchen. This man Lyle, he said. You said you ran away from him. Why? What did he do? Marion hesitated, her eyes darting away. He wasn't a good man, she stammered. Marion, Judah said, stopping in front of her. I need you to tell me everything. No more secrets. If we're going to fight him, I need to know exactly what kind of monster we're dealing with. Marion took a deep, shuddering breath. The story came out in a torrent, a flood of painful memories she had kept dammed up for years. Lyle wasn't just a bad husband. He was a criminal, a con man. He'd been part of a gang that robbed stagecoaches back in Texas. But he was clever. He always let his partners take the fall. He had papers, forged documents, in a way that made him seem like a respectable businessman. The last time I saw him, she whispered, her voice trembling, he'd just come back from a job. 2 men were dead, a guard and a passenger. He was laughing about it. That's when I knew I had to run. I took what little money I had and I just disappeared. Judah listened, his face a mask of cold fury. This changed everything. Lyle wasn't just a threat to Clara. He was a killer, and he was smart enough to use the law as his shield. The papers, Judah said, his mind latching on to the detail. The forged documents. Do you know where he keeps them? Marion thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. He had a saddlebag, she said slowly. A special one, with a false bottom. He kept all his important things in there. He never let it out of his sight. A plan, desperate and dangerous, clicked into place in Judah's mind. If we can get those papers, he said, his voice low and intense, we can prove what he is. We can turn the law against him. But how? Marion asked, her eyes wide. He'll be back any day with the sheriff. We don't have time. Then we have to make time, Judah said. We have to go to him. He looked at Marion, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. He thinks we're scared farmers, hiding and waiting for him. He won't expect us to come looking for a fight. It was insane. It was reckless. It was almost certainly a suicide mission. But as Judah looked at Marion, he knew it was the only way. They couldn't run. They had to fight. And the battle for their family, for their very lives, was about to begin. The plan was simple, which meant 1,000 things could go wrong. Lyle would be staying at the saloon in town, the only place that rented rooms. Judah would ride in under the cover of darkness. His goal, get into Lyle's room, find the saddlebag, and get the papers without being seen. Marion would stay at the ranch, keeping the girls safe and creating a distraction if necessary. Before he left, Judah found Marion in the barn, packing a small bag with food and water. For you, she said, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. Be careful, Judah. He looked down at her, at the worry etched on her face. In that moment, all the anger, all the fear, all the unspoken things between them seemed to fall away. There was only this, 2 people, standing on the edge of a cliff, holding on to each other. He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. I will come back, he said, his voice a low promise. I will come back to you, to all of you. He leaned in and kissed her, a brief, desperate press of his lips against hers. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of promise, a promise to return, a promise of a future. Then, without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off into the night, the fate of their small, fragile family resting entirely on his shoulders. The ride to town was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The wind whispered warnings through the sagebrush. Judah rode with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. He tethered his horse in a small grove of trees a half-mile outside of town and made his way in on foot, sticking to the alleys and shadows. The saloon was a beacon of noise and light in the otherwise sleeping town. Music and raucous laughter spilled out into the street. Judah circled around to the back. He knew the layout of the building. There was a staircase on the outside that led up to the rented rooms. He pulled his hat down low and began to climb, his boots making no sound on the weathered wood. There were 3 rooms on the second floor. Which one was Lyle's? He pressed his ear to the first door. Nothing. The second, he heard a low, rumbling snore. He moved to the third door, at the end of the hall. He heard a faint rustling sound inside. This was it. The lock was old and flimsy. He pulled a small, thin piece of metal from his pocket, a tool he used for mending harnesses, and went to work. After a few tense moments, he heard a soft click. The door was unlocked. He took a deep breath, drew his pistol, and slowly pushed the door open. The room was small and dimly lit by a single oil lamp turned down low. Lyle Thorne was sitting at a small table, his back to the door, hunched over something. His saddlebag was on the floor beside him. Judah's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. He had the element of surprise. He could end this right now. He raised his pistol, the hammer clicking back with a soft, deadly sound. Lyle froze. He didn't turn around. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Farmer," Lyle said, his voice calm and steady. "You're predictable." Judah's blood turned to ice. It was a trap. Before he could react, the closet door burst open and a large burly man lunged at him. Judah fired his pistol, but the man was too fast. He crashed into Judah, sending them both tumbling to the floor. The gun went skittering across the room. Judah fought back, landing a solid punch to the man's jaw, but the man was a mountain. He pinned Judah to the floor, his massive hands closing around Judah's throat. As Judah's vision began to swim, Lyle stood up and walked over, a cruel smile on his face. He picked up Judah's pistol. "You see, Farmer," Lyle sneered, pointing the gun at Judah's head. "You think you're the hero in this story, but you're just a fool who got in my way. And now, you're going to die." Just as Lyle's finger tightened on the trigger, a window shattered. A figure crashed through, landing in a roll on the floor. It was Marion. She was holding Judah's heavy rifle, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "Get away from him!" she screamed. Lyle and his hired thug were so stunned, they froze for a precious second. That was all Judah needed. He slammed his head back into the big man's nose with a sickening crunch. The man roared in pain, his grip loosening. Judah scrambled free, grabbing a chair and smashing it over the man's back, sending him crashing to the floor. Lyle, recovering from his shock, turned Judah's pistol on Marion. But Marion was faster. She fired the rifle. The shot was deafening in the small room. It didn't hit Lyle. It hit the oil lamp on the table, plunging the room into darkness and showering the floor with burning oil. Flames erupted, spreading quickly across the dry wooden floorboards. "Judah!" Marion screamed through the smoke. "The bag!" Judah dove for the saddlebag as Lyle, panicked by the fire, scrambled for the door. Judah's fingers closed around the leather strap just as the flames licked at his boots. He got to his feet and grabbed Marion's hand. "Go! Out the window!" he yelled. They clambered out the broken window and dropped to the roof of the porch below, coughing and choking on the smoke. Below them, the town was waking up. Shouts of "Fire!" echoed through the street. People were pouring out of the saloon. In the chaos, they saw Lyle push his way through the crowd and run toward the stables. He was getting away. "He's not getting away," Judah growled. He and Marion slid from the roof and ran, not away from the fire, but toward the stables, the precious saddlebag clutched in Judah's hand. The final showdown was here. There would be no more running. They caught up to Lyle just as he was untying his horse. "It's over, Lyle," Judah said, his voice raspy from the smoke. He held up the saddlebag. "I have everything." Lyle spun around, his face a mask of rage. He pulled a small derringer from his boot. "That bag is mine!" he shrieked. But just then, a crowd from the town, led by Sheriff Miller and a very pale-looking Pastor Elkins, rounded the corner of the stable. "What in God's name is going on here?" the sheriff boomed. "That man," Marion said, her voice ringing with conviction as she pointed at Lyle. "He's a murderer and a thief, and this bag proves it." She took the bag from Judah and threw it at the sheriff's feet. "There are forged papers in there, proof of robberies in Texas, proof that he's wanted for the murder of 2 men. Lyle laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "She's a hysterical woman, a liar. She's my wife, and she's run off with this farmer. I have a marriage certificate." "Is that so?" said a new voice. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Because the man who was in my store asking questions wasn't just asking about the sheriff. He was trying to hire men who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty, said he needed to reclaim his property from a stubborn rancher. The crowd murmured, their eyes shifting from Lyle to Judah. Sheriff Miller opened the saddlebag and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He scanned them, his eyes widening. "These are warrants," he said, his voice grim. "From Texas, for a man named Lyle Thorne, for stagecoach robbery and murder." Lyle's face went white. The game was up. He raised his derringer, his eyes wild with desperation, and pointed it at Clara, who had woken up from the commotion and run into her mother's arms. "Everybody stay back," he screamed. "I'll shoot the girl." But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had threatened the one thing Judah Keene would die to protect. In a blur of motion, Judah launched himself at Lyle. He didn't care about the gun. He didn't care about the crowd. All he saw was the threat to his family. He slammed into Lyle, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. The derringer went off, the shot going wild. They rolled in the dirt, trading blows, a desperate, brutal fight. Judah was stronger, but Lyle was fueled by a cornered animal's rage. Finally, Judah got the upper hand. He landed a punch that snapped Lyle's head back, dazing him. In that moment, Sheriff Miller and two other men jumped in, pulling Lyle off of Judah and binding his hands. It was over. As the sheriff dragged a cursing and spitting Lyle Thorne away, the crowd slowly dispersed, their whispers following them. Judah got to his feet, bruised and bleeding, but standing tall. He walked over to Marion, who was holding a sobbing Clara. Ellie ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "You were so brave, Pa," she whispered. Judah hugged her tight, then looked at Marion over the top of her head. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from Marion's face. No words were needed. In the fire and the fear and the fight, they had forged something unbreakable. They had become a family. He looked around at the two girls, now clinging to each other, and at the woman who had crashed into his life like a storm and washed it clean. And for the first time in a very long time, Judah Keene felt like he was home. A month later, the first snow of winter began to fall, blanketing the ranch in a peaceful layer of white. The fire in the saloon had been a wake-up call for the town of Dry Hollow. They had seen Judah's courage and Marion's fierce love, and their judgment had turned to respect. Pastor Elkins had even delivered a Sunday sermon on the virtue of forgiveness and the dangers of bearing false witness, his eyes never quite meeting Judah's. Lyle Thorne was gone, sent back to Texas to face the hangman's noose. His shadow no longer touched their lives. Inside the warm ranch house, a fire crackled in the hearth. Ellie and Clara were asleep, curled up together under a large quilt. Judah sat in his usual chair, cleaning his rifle, not out of vigilance, but out of habit. Marion sat across from him, mending one of Ellie's dresses. A comfortable, easy silence filled the room, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full. Judah looked up, watching Marion's hands as she worked the needle and thread, her movements deft and sure. He thought back to that first night, to the desperate woman at his door. He had let her in, thinking it was a mistake, a temporary charity. But it had turned out to be the best decision of his life. She had not only mended his fences and his clothes, she had mended him. "Marion," he said softly. She looked up, a small smile on her face. "I was thinking," he began, his voice a little rough. "This ranch, it's a lot of work for one man. And this house, it's too big for just a father and a daughter." He stood up and walked over to the mantelpiece. He picked up a small object he had been working on for the past week. He had carved it from a piece of sturdy oak, sanding it smooth with his calloused fingers. He walked back to her and knelt down on one knee. He held out his hand. In his palm was a simple, beautiful wooden ring. "It's not gold," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm not a man of fancy words. But I know this. This house isn't a home without you and Clara in it. My life wasn't a life until you came. Marion, will you marry me? Will you make this our home forever?" Tears welled in Marion's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of joy. She didn't say anything. She simply held out her hand. Judah slipped the wooden ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He stood up, pulled her to her feet and kissed her. A long, slow kiss, full of promises kept, and a future just beginning. Outside, the snow fell, covering the hard, unforgiving land in a blanket of pure, clean white. A new season had begun for the ranch in Dry Hollow, and for the family inside, a new life. They had faced the storm and the fire, the judgment of others and the demons of their past, and they had come out the other side not broken, but stronger. A family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by a love as solid and enduring as the land itself. This story shows us that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born into. It's about finding the courage to open a locked door, both literally and figuratively, and letting hope in, even when it looks like trouble. Judah and Marion were two broken people who, instead of trying to fix each other, simply stood together and built something new and beautiful out of the pieces. They proved that home isn't just a place with four walls and a roof. It's the people you'd fight for, the people you'd ride into the fire for. If you believe that the toughest frontiers are the ones inside the human heart, and that second chances are worth fighting for, then you've found your tribe here. We tell the stories of the quiet heroes, the everyday folks who show extraordinary courage when it matters most. So if this story struck a chord, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button, share this story with someone who needs a little hope, and leave a comment below telling us what you would have done in Judah's place. There are a million stories buried out here in the dust, and we're going to keep digging them up. So stick around. The next story is just over the rise. Until then, stay safe and keep fighting the good fight.